Hi everyone, my name is Lindsay, and today I'll be talking with you about antibiotic resistance. This is something that's been coming up more and more. We've been using a lot of our last resort antibiotics recently. About 30 to 40% of an increase has been seen, according to the CDC, depending on the type of antibiotic. So that means that our frontline antibiotics that we typically use are not resolving infections the way that they should. So we've been resorting to our last ones that are our last line of defense when it comes to treating a difficult infection. So we've been seeing an increase in that, but it's not a new concept. Alexander Fleming was the man that discovered penicillin in the 1940s. And when he presented his finding, he also emphasized that antibiotic resistance is real and something that's already being seen, even when he was presenting it as something that's going to be used. He emphasized that we need to use a strong enough dose and at appropriate times in order to slow down antibiotic resistance. And antibiotic resistance is something that happens naturally. It's a great example of how natural selection works. Um, Microbes, like bacteria and other microbes, develop resistance to threats in their environment. So when you have an antibiotic that you take and it goes into your system and it kills off a lot of microbes, like say a bacteria, and the remaining bacteria that survive learn from that. So they're reproducing, like say E. coli can reproduce every 30 minutes. So every 30 minutes we're getting a new generation of these with altered genes, where it takes organisms like humans years to reproduce. So it's not necessarily that it's an accelerated process, it's just that their lifespan is not as long as ours. And so to us it seems like a rapid increase, but on their terms it's it's just a normal progression. So with that, the way that they do that is they have gene mutations that occur when they're exposed to antibiotics. They do horizontal gene transfers between each other with those mutations, and they can also pick up pieces of DNA from microbes that have died, even outside of their own species. They can pick up these pieces of DNA and incorporate them into their own. So we have two main industries where we're having an issue with antibiotic resistance, the main areas. The first is in medicine, human medicine. That's typically what we think of when we think of antibiotic resistance. And that's because we are not prescribing them as well as we should, and as patients, we're not using them as we should. So providers are over prescribing them, and there's a lot to that. Like the length of time it takes to get samples out, get them cultured, and figure out what they're dealing with. And the other is that when somebody is given an antibiotic, a lot of times people aren't using them properly. They're not finishing out the antibiotic, or they're saving them or sharing them with other people. And what that does is like we spoke of earlier, it is increasing that resistance because the microbes are getting exposed to the antibiotic and then they're learning from it without it actually being used to resolve the infection, which is the biggest way that we can use antibiotics while not accelerating antibiotic resistance. The CDC says that 30% of all prescribed antibiotics for hospitalization and outpatients are unnecessary. And part of that is because the testing takes a long time. So when we're looking at ways to combat antibiotic resistance, one of the things that we should be looking at is increasing our effectiveness of our tests and their speed. And that's currently being developed, but that's an area that we need to support and continue developing. And another one that's interesting is agriculture. We use antibiotics a lot in agriculture. 80% of all antibiotics used are used in agriculture. And there are three main reasons why they're used. And the first is treatment of animals. So an animal gets sick and we treat them with an antibiotic, similar to what we do with humans. It's the same process. And another is preventative measures. So if you have a sick chicken in a flock of 100,000 chickens and it's something that is infectious, you're going to want to treat other animals preventatively so you're not seeing an outbreak of illness. And the third is for acceleration of growth. So antibiotics have been used to increase growth rates. It reduces the amount of resources used to treat animals. So they're getting bigger, faster, and they're able to survive more unhygienic conditions because of antibiotics. And a lot of animals are just given a low dose of antibiotics throughout their life to accelerate their growth and prevent disease. And the main concern with this is that when you have low dose antibiotics in the environment all the time, all the microbes in the area are exposed to them and they're not necessarily dying because it's not used at a great enough strength to take care of everything that we're dealing with. And so the microbes in the area become antibiotic resistant. They start developing those genes, and then those antibiotic resistant microbes are then moved to other environments. So they don't just stay on the farm, they move everywhere. So they can move when it rains, they can move when it's dry and the dust takes them, they can move with animal meat and packaging, on trucks, and everything, just the way the other microbes can move around the world as they do. And this is a problem because the more antibiotic resistant microbes we have, the less effective our antibiotics are going to be, and that affects us in human medicine. And even if we're using an antibiotic, like say a tetracycline, that's not used in human medicine, there's have been connections between using tetracycline in animals and an acceleration of antibiotic resistance in cephalosporins, which are an antibiotic we use in human medicine. So there is a connection there. But there's a problem with data collection. So a lot of contention is there between farmers and researchers on being able to go on the properties and collect data and do studies because there's a lot of different reasons. Some of them can be that they don't want to lose their ability to use antibiotics in the way that they want to. And another is that they don't want companies that are using antibiotic resistance as a platform to seek other gains, and amongst a lot of other reasons. And this is a problem because we do need a lot more knowledge about this to see if this is really causing as much of a problem as it could be, and where we can mitigate that. So where can we make changes that would be the most effective without harming the livelihood of farmers, but without affecting the antibiotic resistance that's occurring in the world. And so there's an interesting perspective to that as a consumer. And what you can do is become aware of antibiotic resistance, stay interested in what farmers are doing with antibiotics. And the main line from this is that the opinion of consumers changes the way that a company works, more so than anything else. So if people are not buying a product, or they're concerned about an aspect of a product and they are refusing to buy it without that being addressed, then the company is going to have to comply, or at least address it and do more research. So I think that's a way that we can get researchers and farmers on the same page, is to have consumers be more aware and more concerned about it. There are some other issues like packaging of antibiotic free meats and other products. So according to the CDC, there is no official meaning of what antibiotic free means. And that's a problem, because if you're buying meat because you think that that one was not raised in an environment with a lot of antibiotics, you may not be getting what you think you are. The only regulation is that an animal, their system must be free of antibiotics before they're slaughtered, so that the antibiotics aren't present in the meat or in their system when they're being packaged and sent out. And there's not as much information on that side of things, or what happens if there are antibiotics present in the meat that then could possibly be consumed by a person. So we do want to have both of those considerations in the packaging, and as consumers we can affect that. And another thing is what we do personally with antibiotics. And I mentioned this at the beginning, that people aren't using them properly. And I think part of that is that part of the reason that that occurs is that people don't understand the importance of using them correctly, because they're seeing them like another drug, like an anti-inflammatory that you can take over and over again without affecting the integrity of that drug. Whereas an antibiotic, if used improperly or doesn't have the right stewardship with it, is not going to be available in the future. So what we can do is use them as prescribed. So take the full course of antibiotics, even if you're feeling better, and don't save them for later. So people with chronic infections and things, don't save your antibiotics for later, and don't share with other people. So don't save them thinking that you can share with somebody else if you feel that they might have the same infection that you do, or might want to save it for later because you know that you might get this infection again. It's just best to take them as directed and follow through with the course. And also, don't buy them online or from other resources where you can get them without a prescription. One, because you don't really know what kind of dose you're getting, so you might be getting a lower dose than you bought. And two, because there are a lot of antibiotics used for a lot of different reasons, so you don't want to be giving yourself the wrong one, and you don't want to be using them improperly. So those are all ways that we can address this problem. And the biggest thing that I want to emphasize is that we do need a lot more research on how this is affecting us, and what we can do depends on what we know about it. And then the other is our behavior with it. And the last is that we need to have more awareness as consumers about when they're using antibiotics, because um, I don't think that using them for growth purposes is the best way we can use antibiotics. And that gets tricky because people can say that they're using them as a preventative measure when they're also giving them for growth increase. So we do need to look at our farming and see if there's any way that we can mitigate their use while still maintaining a balance of being able to provide food and being able to stay open as a company, because it is difficult to get the resources that we need to have a big company that produces a lot of meat that is affordable for people. So we just need to do a lot more research on what we can do to keep our standard, while also being aware that we need to make some changes with antibiotics. So this is just a brief overview of antibiotic resistance. There are a lot of great resources, and I invite you, please redo your own research. But below I have provided a few links to speakers that I have learned a lot from, and they provide great perspective and more in-depth information on this topic. So thank you so much for listening. I'm Lindsay, and this was my talk on antibiotic resistance.